So thank you very much everyone for joining us today for our first diversity and inclusion seminar. Today we're going to be focusing on recruitment best practice. So just to introduce myself, my name's Catherine Kellaway. I'm one of the directors at Goodman Masson. Diversity and inclusion I'm really passionate about, and internally at Goodman Masson I've recently taken the lead on our diversity and inclusion change programme. Externally, I think we're really lucky as recruiters and well positioned to support clients with ensuring diversity and inclusion best practice and supporting clients in achieving diversity and inclusion related goals in the hiring process and with the talent that that people attract. One of the initiatives of our change programme was actually to appoint a non-executive director, and we're lucky enough today to actually have Lenna join us and actually support the webinar today. This is the first series, as I mentioned, and we've actually signed Lenna up to do a second webinar around diversity and inclusion strategy. But today, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on the recruitment process. So Lenna, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. It's really great to be able to join you here. Yes, I'm absolutely ecstatic to be joining Goodman Masson as a NED recently. And so I'm currently engaged in my PhD in diversity and inclusion strategy at the University of St Andrews, but I've been working, broadly speaking, in diversity and inclusion for about 20 years. In the most recent past, I've been working for places like the Wellcome Trust, the Royal Society, or the University of Cambridge. So I'm really glad to be able to join you today. Essentially, what we're going to be covering today in terms of our content, we're going to be looking at how we address our data imbalances. So, what is it exactly what methods we can use and how we can use them. We're going to be seeing what can we do differently, and that's particularly in relation to sort of advertising and searches. And then we'll be addressing our unconscious bias, and that's at all the various different stages across the recruitment process.
So as recruiters, I think I mentioned this previously, we know the value of making sure that diversity and inclusion is considered at all stages of the recruitment process. So from writing the job spec through to appointment, and just as important, the retention of talent. And as we're privileged as recruiters to be able to make an impact on achieving diversity and inclusion goals. Recently, we've really noticed the demand increase for diverse shortlists. I think this is highlighted really well by this graph from LinkedIn here. As you can see, the demand for diversity roles within organisations has absolutely kind of skyrocketed recently, and so lots of organisations have got individuals who are responsible for diversity and inclusion strategy, and we're seeing the impact of that in the shortlist. As an organisation, Goodman Masson's put a lot of investment into understanding best practice from the recruitment process, something that is constantly evolving and we're developing. And I think we see that it's really important that actually it's a collective effort, that we work in partnership with clients, experts in this field, to actually share knowledge of best practice and all kind of move forward together. Lenna, one thing I wanted to really focus on from conversations with clients so far, there's a lot of confusion around positive action, the difference between positive action and positive discrimination, what it is, when you can use it. So it'd be really useful if you could give a bit of an overview of positive action.
Absolutely, yeah, and you're absolutely right, Catherine, in terms of the way that we can implement and utilise positive action is such a really proactive way of addressing diversity and inclusion. It should be a real core component of who we are and what we do in this area. Positive action versus positive discrimination is a really key point to make, because positive discrimination in the UK is illegal, whereas in other areas such as the US, positive discrimination is a norm. So positive action is an opportunity to take a look at when you've got two different candidates, for example, who have an equal level of merit in your application pool. So if you've got two different candidates who both reach the standards you expect at about the same level, if they're reaching the same level in terms of their equality of merit that they've got, then if one has a particular protected characteristic, then that can be a way of breaking a tie between two different candidates. So it's really key area that we can use in terms of providing opportunities for people from a protected characteristic group or who are particularly disadvantaged or underrepresented in your demographic pool.
Okay, and what do you need to do to be able to use positive action or to kind of start positive action?
This is where we get into data points that we raised earlier on. This is where you really need to start examining the data and the information that you have available to you and to start collecting the data so that you can use it. And we'll give you an example of that shortly as well. But where are you finding demographic underrepresentation? Are you asking the people who you're hiring? Are you asking your applicants? Really examining and finding out where those gaps in your data are.
Yeah, and a couple of examples of questions which have recently come up. So when can you use positive action?
Across the board in terms of your application process. Sorry to interrupt, but it's something you can use from the very beginning, even when you start at advertising level, if you're looking at specialist networks, and we'll come back to that as well in a moment, but you can use it at your shortlist, for example, if you wanted to use no single sex shortlist. But you can also use it at that offer point when you're making that decision making point between the difference between two candidates, where you've got that two candidate tie break and you want to decide who it is. And so all those levels are opportunities for you to use a positive action.
So right throughout the recruitment process, I think is the important point there.
Yeah.
And another question that I've had this recently. So can a client ask for an all-female shortlist?
It may be that you get an all-female shortlist from a recruitment like a recruiter like Goodman Masson, and one of the really good things about using a recruiter who does really good work in this area. So Goodman Masson have done positive action training for all of their teams. It means that you'll get a really good candidate pool, but that's that really important distinction between positive action and positive discrimination. Your candidates you'll get, we can't choose a candidate based on their gender alone unless it's to distinguish between equal merited candidates.
Yeah, so I think, if a kind of line manager comes to me and says, I want an all-female shortlist, they can definitely ask for that shortlist if they've identified the underrepresentation of female talent. I guess my response as a recruiter is, look, I will work to provide you a shortlist. They will, if they are all females, they will be the best candidates or of equal measure, but I can't guarantee it because, then we're getting into the territory of discrimination. Is that correct? Yeah,
exactly.
And then I think any more examples? You mentioned single sex shortlists there.
Yeah, no,
examples
absolutely.
of positive action.
I mean, a couple of different ones included if you're going to have one individual, if you've got a short list of all men, and make sure that you include a woman on that list to make sure that you are including a demographic representation. I think the key thing there is the proportionality, what's appropriate for the circumstances that you're in. Positive action has a really loose level of restrictions around what it can be, and so you can be quite flexible at how you engage with it. And so it's about making sure that you've used a proportionate response to the underrepresentation or disadvantages that your groups are finding. So another example is subgroups that were from a nominations committee that were looking at saying, okay, well, we're going to have a subgroup that looks for women because we have an underrepresentation of women. So you want to increase the pool of people in that applicant pool who are female, and then you want to increase from any other demographics in the similar ways.
Yeah, I think that was the thing that, once I started exploring positive action, we had more training on it, the flexibility that the law allows around it to make sure, like you say, there's got to be a kind of common sense kind of justification that the action that you've taken is reasonable, but the law is fairly flexible. And I guess that's where the kind of complexity of it kind of comes in for people.
Exactly.
But I think to kind of highlight here, as recruiters, we definitely think, use it when you can. And I think it's probably not utilised as much as it could be at the moment in the market, and hopefully something that we see grow as more organisations have got a focus on diversity and inclusion and how to improve their workforce.
Yeah, absolutely.
Moving on now to advertising. I think, if we keep doing this advertising in the same places and writing the same kind of adverts, we're going to get the same results. So if we're looking to kind of change the talent pools that we're attracting, I think one of the things that we make sure we do on adverts is make sure we've got an ED&I statement. I think making sure that statement is authentic to your organisation is really important.
Absolutely.
And I think linked to that, Glassdoor highlight that from research has shown that applicants will only apply, 73% of applicants apply when they can see that their values align to an advert. I think, you know, that backs up the importance of making sure that your company's got a clear ED&I statement. I think another question that's important to ask yourself in your adverts is, where is your advert reaching? What talent pool is it reaching? So have you gone out of your way to build new networks and reach new talent pools that you perhaps weren't getting your advert to before? So this is an area that Goodman Masson's recently done a lot of work in, building new networks. And then I think another really important area is actually challenging the criteria that goes into those adverts. So we know research written in a binary way when we're talking about men and women, because that's the way the research is written. But the research shows that men will apply when they meet 60% of the criteria, but women will only apply when they meet to the criteria. So really kind of thinking about the criteria, is it essential to kind of broaden the brief and actually hopefully increase the pool of females that are applying. Again, with language, we know that talking about the way that men and women respond to certain words has been researched, and the research tells us that certain words feel. There's lots of developments in technology now which will analyze your advert. So any advert that someone at Goodman Masson posts will go through a gender decoder, and will work we can change those kind of gendered words to make it a more neutral advert. And I think another important thing is avoiding tokenism. So I think in some, you see examples of where it might say, we encourage BAME employees to apply. I think it's important to make sure that people aren't feeling like there might be a diversity hire. So we would suggest avoiding that. Growth mindset versus fixed mindset. So making sure that your language is focused on a growth mindset. A good example of this might be, a growth mindset might be highlighting the opportunity to grow and talking about the potential skills that can be developed, whereas a fixed mindset is talking about focused on perceived characteristics that already are inherent. So for example, you might ask for an expert in their field. And I think thinking about the types of language that is going into your adverts, in a similar vein, looking at ableist, making sure you use ableist language. So it might be that you've previously wrote speaks with stakeholders, you'd want to change that to communicates with stakeholders. Or you might have previously written see trends and you change that to identify trends, just to make sure you're being inclusive there. And then in a similar vein, in terms of, if we move on from advertising to thinking about searching, again, if we search in the same way, you're going to come up with the same results. So expanding techniques beyond traditional search techniques. So LinkedIn, for example, one thing that Goodman Masson's invested in is understanding advanced search criteria. So being able to actually search for more females. So there's markets that we understand that we've got underrepresentation of female candidates. So one thing that the Equal Opportunities Act allows us to do is actually proactively put effort into searching for more female talent to diversify our talent pool. So something that we've done recently, and I think in line with that is actually building networks of diverse talent, as I mentioned earlier. So those networks, a lot of them already exist, so it's actually putting the time and energy into building relationships with those networks. There's a couple of examples there that, you know, for example, one of my teams focuses on social housing. All those networks and networks that we've recently built partnerships with to be able to share our adverts with people in those networks and those communities.
I'm going to take you through some information on reducing bias throughout the recruitment process. There are a number of things that we need to take into consideration. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about unconscious bias, or implicit bias, as some people describe it, and that's from Project Implicit, which is organised by Mazarine Banerjee at Harvard in the US, and that's implicit.harvard.edu. Thing to keep in mind and remember is that bias can impact the recruitment selection process from the very beginning through to the very end. One of the first ways, and one of those prevalent ways, was going to be what we call affinity bias. And affinity bias is that bias where you are biased towards or against sometimes people who are like you. And so if somebody went to the same university as you, if somebody comes from a similar background to you, if somebody studied something that is the same subject as yours, these are all things and ways that we can think of that we might choose somebody to be more like us. And so we really must be able to be conscious about how we look at that. Another thing that we can do is, a lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about in this slide particularly is about what we shouldn't do, or what we won't do, or we, you know, what's the things we want to avoid doing. But this one particularly is about what we can proactively do, and so that's conscious inclusion. How do we make sure that we're including people throughout the process? And that can be as simple as, you know, Catherine was talking about previously in the previous slide, in terms of talking about not using ableist language, and ableist language is ways of excluding people from the process and the practice. And so being consciously inclusive, how can you deliberately make sure that you're including people in this process? Positive action we talked about before, and positive action is a way of making sure that we look at and we are addressing, and that's another way of reducing bias, and we talked about that previously. But next, the thing is that a lot of people talk about is anonymous CVs. Now, we know that there's a lot of research, quite a bit of it out there, and you can find where it talks about how somebody's judged just based on their name and they're eliminated. So somebody whose name is Mohammed versus Adam has to submit, you know, 10 or 12 more applications to get an interview based on exactly the same CV. And there are similar biases experienced for people who have on a gender basis as well. So one of the things that people often say, oh, well, you know, we'll take all of the names out, we'll remove the universities, and that will mean we don't have bias in this process. But bias will follow you through. So what I would advise is that if you are going to use anonymous CVs, that you do so as only one part of your bias reduction program. So keep it through and take it through the whole process as you go along. Next, another way of being particularly consciously inclusive is providing a flexibility of interview times. That means that keeping in mind that not everybody will be able to come to a very early morning meeting or to a late afternoon meeting. There's any number of reasons for that. For disability reasons, for childcare reasons, for any, you know, I'm working another job and it works these hours reasons. Take all of those things into consideration when you're offering times and being more flexible about your interview options. Diverse interview panel, I can't reiterate this one enough. It really does matter who the person who's interviewing sees in front of them when they're interviewing, because it changes their level of comfort. If you see people who are like you, then you are able to relax a bit more. If everybody on front of you is not like you, then that adds an additional layer of tension for you to the interview. So, and that's not just about the people who are on the panel itself. I mean, when we're back into physical meeting and when we're in rooms, what are the pictures on the walls? Who do they represent? Who do they look like? Who's represented there? Can I see myself working in this environment based on who you've put in front of me? And finally, looking at benefits and how those are offered and what their choices. I mean, are we taking into consideration the impact of something like maternity leave or sick pay as regards to an individual who may be working for us? I think these are really key aspects of any sort of recruitment and selection process in terms of how we want to make sure we're reducing bias, but also really being consciously inclusive in how we recruit and select people.
Monitoring and reporting, I guess this is the kind of backbone of everything that we've been talking about. If you don't understand where your shortfalls are, where that underrepresentation is occurring, you can't kind of create strategy and plans as to, you know, what you need to do as an organization to actually, you know, close the gap on that underrepresentation that might exist. So one thing that Gumma mustn't do is at every stage of the recruitment process, we will have a survey that goes out to from applicants through to when someone has their CV sent, through to interview, through to when someone's been offered and accepted, to kind of understand and so to ask people to share their diversity data. I think something that's really important on this form, and I think you've advised this as well, Lenna, is, you know, explaining why you're using that data and what you're doing with that data, so people know that actually there's going to be a benefit to them sharing that data with you. I think once you've got that data, you can then start to analyze, review the data and understand, you know, where the shortfalls come in. I think the question to be asking at that stage is what does good look like? What could be, you know, what's our current state? I think one thing that we've invested in recently is with LinkedIn Talent Insights is to understand what does the gender breakdown for different markets. So for example, you can see here with this is charities finance, you can see as it gets, the more senior the roles get, the fewer females there are. So I think to understand what the market you're transacting in looks like, and to understand your current state, and then actually to start to bridge the gap, and then actually to start to bridge the gap between what's the best, you know, which marketplaces actually have the best female to male representation, actually drive towards that. One thing that you have picked us up, Lenna, is our basic use of gendered traditional gender roles there with that image, and I think is, you know, points to exactly why we need you on board, and, you know, the journey that everyone's on in terms of understanding where some of your biases actually exist and things that you just don't even notice. So thanks for that. But yeah, as I mentioned there, once you've kind of identified that, it's about looking at actually where can you find, if you're not getting the talent in the first place, you know, if at the initial stage you're not actually getting a representative talent pool, what do you need to do to access new talent pools? If that talent doesn't exist, what strategies do you need to put in place to bring talent in and train people up? You know, what have you done in terms of building networks, and what targets have you set as an organisation to actually close those gaps? And I think, Lenna, you shared this diagram with me. I think a really good example.
Yeah, and I think it's a way of looking at seeing how you maintain gender balance, or whatever underrepresented group you're looking at, balance in the pool across all the different stages of the application. So if your application pool has 30, if you have 30 applications in your pool and 20 of them are orange and 10 of them are yellow, for example, with your minority population, what often happens is you get to the end of the recruitment stage and you no longer have any yellow applicants. And so what this shows is that at each level, you maintain the exact proportion of applicants from each group in this application pool. So 33% demonstrates the balanced process from stage to stage. And that 80% and 50% demonstrates a balanced success rate per group. So it means that you're managing to keep all along that different pathway, the representation that you've got of your underrepresented populations.
Yeah, I think this highlights where, you know, at different stages you might apply different approaches of positive action. I think
absolutely. Ways of doing so. Yeah.
And I think, you know, I mentioned at the beginning there, talking about sharing best practice and sharing what people are doing. Just a couple of clients that we've had conversations with or on the PSL as preferred suppliers. Riverside Housing Association, they've called it their BAME strategy. I know that's a debated term, but that's what they've kind of focused on. And their BAME strategy is around, first of all, they didn't have enough senior BAME employees within their organisation. Off the back of the McGregor-Smith report, they identified that. And they set their strategy to be, actually, we need to broaden the criteria of what we're asking for, because to bring talent into the sector, we need to broaden that brief of what we're asking for. Then the other thing they've said they'll do is reverse mentoring. So where we've got that underrepresentation at a senior level, but to have the voices heard of our BAME employees, let's establish BAME mentoring. And then again, positive action around, if people meet the minimum criteria, so that broadened criteria, we will guarantee that anyone who is BAME is interviewed. And then Nest, I think they're a good example, the government pension provider, of they ask us for data on anyone that is seen through the recruitment process. So they monitor people right from application through to acceptance, and then actually beyond that into retention. And they review that data on a quarterly basis and actually set targets off the back of that data. And EY, they're a good example of, they've recently established a scheme where they've committed to 30% of their trainee hires being Black trainees. So I think what Goodman Masson's committed to do is once a quarter, we're going to share best practice that we come across in the market, and just circulate that across on our diversity and inclusion newsletters.
I think that's a really good way of one of the really important ways of doing this work is being able to share good practice across the sector in terms of what we're seeing other places and what we can try and what may or may not work in what we're doing every day.
Yeah,
so this has been this has been our half-hour session, a quick one, and we've covered sort of 3 key areas here today, looking at sort of where are the talent gaps and where the gaps in your talent pool are, and how we examine the data in order to identify that. What networks can we identify to access these new talent pools, and so who can we speak to, who can we look out? What can we really do differently? And then just really being aware of our biases and how what are the biases of our hiring managers, ourselves, and everybody who's been involved in the recruitment process.
Yeah, definitely. I think they're 3 great questions to kind of ask yourself and ask hiring managers. You know, if you start with those kind of questions, and this is a question you actually asked me, which I then asked my managers, you know, can your hiring managers communicate your organization's D&I strategy? And I think, you know, knowing what you're doing and what you're looking to achieve, I think is really important.